Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled, Democracy Dies in Darkness and Superstition. The motto of the Washington Post is, Democracy Dies in Darkness. And I'm going to show you in this video that that's exactly what the Washington Post is doing, killing democracy. The prophets at the Washington Post say, another hurricane is about to batter our coast. Trump is complicit. Let's see if that makes any sense. Note that in the first paragraph they immediately back off from their title. They say, if the category 4 hurricane does indeed hit the Carolinas this week, it will be the strongest storm on record to land so far north. In the bottom paragraph they say, there is no reasonable doubt humans are priming the earth for disasters. Well, had the Washington Post editorial board actually done any research, they would have known that what they were saying had no scientific basis. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says the exact opposite. Current data sets indicate no significant observed trends in global tropical cyclone frequency over the past century. No robust trends in annual numbers of tropical storms, hurricanes, and major hurricane counts have been identified over the past 100 years in the North Atlantic. There continues to be a lack of evidence and thus low confidence regarding the sign of trend in the magnitude and/or frequency of floods on a global scale. Low confidence in observed trends in small-scale severe weather phenomena such as hail and thunderstorms. Low confidence in a global-scale observed trend in drought. Confidence in large-scale changes in the intensity of extreme extratropical cyclones since 1900 is low. Now let's go back and look at the Washington Post claim again. They say, there is no reasonable doubt that humans are priming the earth for disasters. When they say there's no reasonable doubt, that must have come from talking to Democrats at cocktail parties, because the scientists say the exact opposite. Now let's look at the first claim in their article. They say that if the Category 4 hurricane does indeed hit the Carolinas this week, it will be the strongest storm on record to land so far north. Well, that claim simply isn't true. Category 4 Hurricane Hazel hit right at about the same spot on the Carolina coast in 1954. Hazel was the third major hurricane to strike the East Coast that year. The first two major hurricanes to hit the East Coast in 1954 were Carol and Edna. Those were the last two major hurricanes to hit New England. In the past 60 years, New England has been hit by no major hurricanes. Can you imagine the hysteria at the Washington Post if we had a repeat of 1954 now? Hurricane Hazel, the third major hurricane of that year, ravaged 7 states: South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York. Then it went up to Canada and became Canada's deadliest hurricane. It created a huge storm surge on Lake Ontario, which killed more than 100 people in the Toronto area. Hazel was one of the worst hurricanes of the last century. Now let's compare its track to that forecast for Florence. As of 5 a.m. September 12, 2018, NOAA is forecasting that Florence will make landfall at just about the same spot where Hazel did. But unlike Category 4 Hazel in 1954, NOAA is currently forecasting that Florence won't even be a major hurricane when it makes landfall, and that it'll slow down pretty quickly. Let's go back and look at the Washington Post claim one more time. If the Category 4 hurricane does indeed hit the Carolinas this week, it will be the strongest storm on record to land so far north. Well, everything in that sentence is wrong. It wouldn't have been the strongest storm on record to land so far north. Hazel was just as far north, and it's not forecast to be Category 4 anymore. Instead of blaming President Trump for an imaginary increase in hurricanes, which is not supported by scientists, perhaps the Washington Post should be examining their own incompetent editorial board. According to Phil Klotzbach at Colorado State University, the number of major hurricane landfalls on the East Coast is way down over the last 50 years. From 1915 to 1965, the East Coast had 19 major hurricane landfalls. But in the past 51 years, there's only been 7. The frequency of major hurricanes hitting the East Coast is down more than 60%. It's becoming clear that the Washington Post editorial is based on superstition and has no scientific basis whatsoever. The trend is the exact opposite of what the Washington Post editorial board is claiming. Let's go back and look at the news from a couple of years ago. In 2015, it was reported that the U.S. was in the longest hurricane drought in recorded history. And then in 2016, Scientific American reported hurricane drought hits a new record. That was right before President Trump was elected. And now the Washington Post is blaming hurricanes on President Trump. It's unbelievable. If the Washington Post wants to blame hurricanes on presidents, they're going to have put Grover Cleveland at the top of their list. This graph plots the number of hurricanes per year for each president going back to Millard Fillmore in the 1850s. Grover Cleveland was president for 2 terms, and during his 8 years in office, the United States was hit by an incredible 26 hurricanes. One of those hurricanes, the Indianola hurricane of 1886, wiped the city of Indianola, Texas off the map permanently. The United States was hit by 7 hurricanes that year. Texas was hit by 4 hurricanes in 1886, and Florida was hit by 3. And the amazing thing was that many of those hurricanes came in June. The U.S. almost never gets June hurricanes anymore. The other top 3 hurricane presidents were Rutherford B. Hayes and William Howard Taft. George Bush Jr. came in the 4th place. Our best hurricane president was Barack Obama. He had just barely over 1/2 hurricane per year compared to more than 3 while Grover Cleveland was president. And that makes sense because if you remember in 2008, Obama said that he healed the planet. If the Washington Post believes that presidents are responsible for hurricanes, they should probably push for impeachment of Grover Cleveland, Rutherford B. Hayes, and William Howard Taft. But I'm not done yet with the fake news Washington Post. In fact, I'm just getting started with their nonsense. The Washington Post is taking full advantage of all the hysteria surrounding Hurricane Florence. Category 6 hurricanes? Climate change may cause more hurricanes to rapidly intensify. In little more than a day, Hurricane Florence exploded in strength, jumping from a Category 1 to a Category 4 behemoth with 140-mile-per-hour winds. This process, hurricanes intensifying fast, is both extremely dangerous and poorly understood. But never mind that it's poorly understood. We're going to jump in there and say storms will do it faster and more often, and in some extreme cases grow so powerful that they might arguably be labeled Category 6. Category 6? That sounds really scary. And it's the exact same story which they were pimping 30 years ago. 1988 was the year when NASA's James Hansen made the global warming scare official before Congress. December 7th, 1988, Washington. Global warming may increase the strength of hurricanes, posing a lethal threat to low-lying areas already facing inundation from rising sea levels. Maximum hurricane winds peak at 175 miles per hour now, but they could reach 220 miles per hour by the middle of the next century. Forecasts of 220 mile per hour winds in 1988? That sounds really scary. But had these scientists actually paid attention to what was going on that year, they would have known that Hurricane Gilbert already brought 220 mile per hour winds that year. On this date 30 years ago, Hurricane Gilbert was just about to smash into the Yucatan. Here's a newspaper article from Wednesday, September 14, 1988. Storm's 220 mile per hour force awes experts. Hurricane Gilbert grew on Tuesday into a giant, spine-chilling monster, the most powerful hurricane ever witnessed by tropical weather experts in the Western Hemisphere. I was living in Houston at the time, and I was busy taping up windows because Gilbert was forecast to head directly towards Houston. We're observing this in awe. This is the benchmark. This is the record one. It's almost beyond belief in terms of the historic record. Bob Sheets, National Hurricane Center. By 3 p.m., Gilbert's sustained winds around a tightly wound central eye were measured at 175 miles per hour. Gusts were recorded at 220 miles per hour. In contrast, the storm had smashed Monday with winds of 120 miles per hour and gusts to 146. The U.S. coastline has been hammered only twice by Category 5 storms, One was the 1935 Labor Day hurricane, which hit Florida, killing 600 people. The other was 1969's Hurricane Camille, from which beachfront ruins are still visible in Biloxi, Mississippi. It left 256 dead. Since this article was written in 1988, the U.S. was hit by one more Category 5 hurricane. That was Hurricane Andrew in 1992, which was more than 25 years ago. The Washington Post article was based around the idea that Hurricane Florence rapidly increased its wind speeds up to 140 miles per hour. In contrast, Gilbert rapidly increased its wind speeds up to 175 miles per hour with 220 mile per hour gusts. And when Hurricane Gilbert hit in 1988, atmospheric CO2 was below James Hansen's safe level of 350 parts per million. Gilbert was an incredibly powerful hurricane and formed when carbon dioxide was low. It destroyed much of the Yucatan, then it went off and hit Mexico again. Fortunately, it spared Houston, where I was living. Because of the extremely high wind speeds and low central pressure of Gilbert, experts described it as a monster tornado. America's deadliest hurricane occurred this week in 1900, when the city of Galveston, Texas was nearly destroyed. 10,000 people were killed by a giant storm surge. The deadliest Atlantic hurricane occurred in 1780 during the Revolutionary War. 23,000 people died in that storm. I suppose the Washington Post, who was named after George Washington, would say that that storm was caused by emissions from Washington's sport utility horse. Now let's look at the climate scientist claims that rising sea levels are caused by global warming. There's simply no truth to that. Over the last 20,000 years, sea level has risen 120 meters or 400 feet, and the rate of sea level rise is very slow now compared to most of the last 20,000 years when sea level was rising very quickly. The tide gauge at Key West, Florida shows that over the past century, sea level has been rising at a very slow, steady rate. There is no indication that sea level rise rates have accelerated over the last century, which would be the indication of a warming planet. Not at Key West, and not at most of the other tide gauges located around the world. My good friend Dr. Bill Gray, who passed away 2 years ago, was the world's leading tropical meteorologist, and he was the guy who invented modern hurricane forecasting. Bill grew up in Washington, D.C., and if he were still alive today, he would be setting the record straight with the Washington Post. On his deathbed, Bill asked me to carry on his legacy of setting the record straight about climate, and that's largely the reason why I do this. In 1993, Dr. Gray was invited by Vice President Al Gore to a global warming meeting which Gore was hosting. Bill told the Vice President that he'd be happy to attend, but he was not a big believer in Al Gore's theories about global warming. Bill had gotten funding from NOAA for his hurricane research every year for about 30 years prior to that, but as soon as he told Al Gore that, he got his funding cut off and never got another penny out of the government for his research. Imagine that. The top tropical meteorologist in the world couldn't get any funding from the government simply because he refused to accept their global warming scam. And that is how Al Gore created consensus, by cutting off funding to anyone who wouldn't go along with his scam. Very few scientists have the strength or integrity to stick to their guns like Bill did, and as a result, global warming has degenerated into the clown show which it currently is. The Washington Post motto is "Democracy dies in darkness," and that's exactly where they're operating from. They rely on anonymous sources, fake news, censorship, and baseless scientific gibberish. The Washington Post is working to destroy the very democracy which George Washington created. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.